the context, but I think we've already heard quite a bit through the plenary sessions today and yesterday. You know, when I was a student in my graduate student days, we were always told that don't link trade with all these other non-trade issues, environment, labor, etc. But today that seems to be in vogue. Trade policies were never seen as good instruments to address non-trade concerns. But I think today we are in a very different world, and we have to take cognizance of the interlinkages between trade and many other aspects of our livelihoods or our well-being, etc. Now, as you know, people have already mentioned, trade has an impact on the environment in multiple ways, both positive and negative. So the negative part, everybody accepts that increased economic activity, the way things are transported, etc., can have a bad effect on the environment. Similarly, you could have dumping of all sorts of waste and recycled products, and which damage the environment. On the other hand, trade gives you access to technologies, better products, more environment-friendly products, etc. So trade can also be a means to actually address climate action. In light of all this, of course, we are also seeing the increased use of unilateral measures. So countries have to take cognizance of how they actually produce, how they trade, the carbon emissions of their activities, etc. So increasingly, I think the interconnectedness between trade and environment, whether you like it or not, in your industrial policies, in your trade policies, investment policies, in all of this, it has to get integrated. So today's session is really trying to understand that from a regional perspective, what exactly is going on in terms of trade in environmental goods and services and environmentally preferred goods. Second is, to what extent can we address some of the barriers to increasing trade in such products? And what's the scope for regional cooperation in this? And here we have panelists who will provide a regional perspective, but some who will also draw upon their specific employment-related perspective. Some will address specific issues, for instance, of women and what role they could play, the role of MSMEs in this process, and specific challenges that some of these segments face. So we have quite a diversity of experience here around the table. And so without further ado, I will start with Pramila Crivelli, who will provide us with the broader context of trade trends in environmental goods and services and EPPs and what's happening in the region.
Okay, thank you very much, Rupa, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the organizer for having me here. Today is really a great pleasure to be in Kathmandu. I think it's my only third time in Nepal, and I really appreciate the opportunity. One question is, how do I put the slides there?
Is there a clicker?
The clicker, it was already there. Okay, understood. Okay, perfect. So I have a few slides to present. Sorry, thank you. I have a few slides to present to you. Because, as mentioned by Rupa, my presentation is more of a setting the scene, discussing the broad, concept. Although these have been discussed already or mentioned yesterday, but I will provide also some figures and trends. So, first of all, trade in environmental goods is on the rise. This is the case everywhere, but it has been clearly stated yesterday. We have a high concentration in this type of trade. And yesterday it was mentioned that only, I think, 3 economies are really dominating the market. Here what you have on screen is the subsample of looking only at Asia and the Pacific economies. But even within Asia and the Pacific, we observe a very high concentration with a massive trade surplus, but with only 6 economies that are, in fact, net exporters. And these are the PRC, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, and Cambodia. And if you look at the countries in the table, you can see that South Asian economies tend to lag behind and are all actually net importers of this type of goods. So the question is how could we, leverage opportunities? How could we integrate more in this type of markets? In the graph, I don't know how to. Here. Okay, I cannot point, but in the graph is the red part is South Asia. So you can see, like in 2022, the amount was 26 billions of exports of environmental goods, so relatively small. Okay, so that's for first. But if you look at intra-regional trade, so within regions, so East Asia is still dominating, just like it was the case in the previous slide. These are the major, exporters of environmental goods. And the share of environmental goods in intra-regional trade in East Asia is also higher than in other Asia and the Pacific regions. But what is interesting to see is that these shares are declining, while in other regions, and particularly in South Asia, they are increasing, which leads to the conclusion that maybe there is also opportunities at the regional level to build the regional value chains of this type of goods. Okay. Now, why are we talking about environmental goods and services in the first place? It's not that we just want to trade more. I think it has been mentioned by Rupa when we talk about trade, there is also, a scale effect, a competition effect. So the idea of trading more in these environmental goods and services is that hopefully eventually it would help us also reduce carbon intensity and address, climate change despite the scale effect. Because of course, the more we trade, in theory, the more we produce carbon emissions. And that is, I think, the most classical example of solar panel or photovoltaic panels, where you see over the years that exports have increased significantly. And it's directly associated with also the capacity of solar panels that has increased. And so overall, we have also seen a sharp drop in the costs through trade, through increased productions, making those technologies and those systems also more affordable. So there is also this consideration is that you have a scale effect, but also you make them more affordable, and eventually it can become also it can help address climate challenges. Okay. Now, the results I'm presenting here today are actually all part of a report that was launched in Geneva in June at the Global Aid for Trade Review. So I'm mentioning this because you may wonder how come this analysis comes here. It's an analysis that has been extracted from the report, and I think it's highly relevant because what it was showing is that trade in general, any type of trade, and also trade in environmental goods, or let's say here we were looking at imports of green goods, they are directly associated with green patent application. And because one of the main challenges that might not have been discussed that much in the last yesterday and this morning is also about the fact that there is a very high concentration of patents and innovation in the world, and really only few countries are innovating. So the question is, can trade, and especially trade in environmental goods and services, can help also with technology transfer and technology diffusion and adoption? And those results that you have on screen actually suggest that, yes, it's the case. And that's why it's particularly important to look at how we can address the restrictions on those goods. So more specifically, what we find is that higher imports are associated with an increase in patenting, like with 1% increase in imports, with 0.5% in increase in green patent application. And so, and you see also subcategories in adaptation, mitigation, power generation. So in all the different categories, we see positive associations. So I think that's a very good signal that trade can be also a vehicle for green technology transfers. Okay. Now, there are still challenges. Okay, these are the opportunities. Now we move to the challenges. The challenges is that we have high tariffs on environmental goods. and especially high in South Asia, especially in India and Pakistan, with 5 to 7% of tariffs on this type of goods. And the question is, how do we collaborate to reduce those tariffs and how to facilitate the goods in, that could be through tariffs, but it can be through trade facilitation measures, through, even certifications, or like it was mentioned yesterday, regional certification, or any type of measures that could help facilitate the trade in these goods. And that would really significantly foster regional value chains, global value chains, and also help in terms of trade diversification. And I think one important aspect is also to remind the private sector, when we think about it, is not just about raising cost, because here it's gonna, if you think of facilitating access to those goods, it can also help improve competitiveness. And I think that's also a way to address the question on how we get the private sector on board. So keeping in mind that but reducing tariffs should help increase competitiveness and technology spillovers. One way to foster regional cooperation could be, it's one among others, through trade agreements. It's not a panacea, it's not the only way, but what we find in this report, it's interesting because we show that preferential trade agreements do increase on average trade by 5.5%. But then the presence of environmental provisions would decrease trade. This is what we would expect indeed, because it's actually, not restricting, but putting some sort of rules on trade. It's reducing the effect of the trade agreements in the first place, but it's reducing even more the carbon emissions. So it means that it suggests that eventually the presence of environmental provisions in trade agreements do help to reduce emission intensity, either by shifting trade within the trade agreements toward cleaner products or encouraging technology and transfer and adoption of new production techniques. So as a final slide, because this is really to set the scene of what we could do, I think the main message is that international cooperation, I wrote international on purpose because it's regional, but also international. We can think broader than just a region. Is key to liberalize environmental goods, but also services, and also indirectly. What I mean by that is just because the example of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements, shows, according to our analysis, that environmental services have been liberalized on average a little bit more than other types of services. But the RCEP is known for having no environmental provisions, for not addressing at all environment. So it seems that even regional cooperation that led to a trade agreements that was not addressing directly climate may have actually a positive effect in terms of environmental sustainability. Now, challenges is definition. Which type of definition do we want to adopt? The nomenclature. There are APEC list, 53 products that is going to be expanded. The OECD that is more defined on processes of productions, and WTO and others. So I think this is up to the region to define what is the best for them. And I think it has been mentioned by Rupa yesterday, it's very important to consider the whole value chains. What are your value chains in South Asia? And considering goods from the beginning to the end to try to decide which goods you want to promote. You don't need necessarily to adopt a list of another region, just as such, because it might not be completely applicable to your region, but try to consider the whole production supply chains process. And I mentioned trade agreements, but there are different forms of collaborations. Okay, we don't know if SARC is ever going to, progress or not, but you can consider smaller type of agreements, bilateral, open plurilateral, start an agreement with a partner country and keep it open for other countries to join. I think what has been discussed yesterday between Nepal and Bangladesh on exporting electricity, and this type of agreements is steps in the correct direction. And then you have also very broad agreement like green economy agreement that I believe for South Asia is a little bit, I mean, maybe too early to discuss this type of agreement, but think of even memorandum of understanding, mutual recognitions of certifications of these type of products can help liberalize them and eventually promote technology transfer and reduce carbon emissions. And I think that's it for my presentation. I hope I have not exceeded the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pramila. Thank you for raising a lot of interesting points. I mean, of course, you started with the balancing of the scale and composition effect. You brought in the aspect of technology transfer and how trade can enable that, and I'm so sure some of the other speakers will touch upon that. The issue of trade agreements in particular, I know some other speakers will also talk about it, and how PTA provisions regarding environment can have a beneficial effect. I like the point about environmental services in particular, because we talk all the time about goods, but in services, the kind of commitments that you can take, which potentially also have a beneficial effect. And there are many other ways of actually looking at collaboration and liberalization from the service sector as an input into the production process. Taxonomy, a very important issue, classification issues, and I think other panelists will talk about it. And yes, not necessarily looking at mega collaboration, but even smaller sort of ways and more open sort of collaborative informal mechanisms might also be at work. So thank you very much for laying out the context. Now I'll turn to Kshitij. I guess you will be building upon some of what she has discussed, showing the trends in South Asia and touching upon some of the barriers as well that affect this trade.
Thank you, Dr. Chanda. I will also start with a very brief presentation to provide an overview of the trade in environmental goods in the region. So I think I'll need someone in the back to put the presentation in this screen. My presentation and the subsequent discussion also touches upon many of the excellent points raised by Dr. Pramila earlier, but I'll try to bring in some fresh insights as well. And I'll also try to draw from a study that we had done in Saudi about the green growth and trade in environmental goods and services under the guidance of Dr. Poshraj Pandey, who also happens to be here among us. So let me start with the trend of trade in environmental goods in the region. And for this graph, we use the OECD list of environmental goods as the reference. For those of you who may not be familiar with the classification of environmental goods, there is not a single universally accepted, internationally accepted list of what qualifies as environmental goods and environmentally preferable goods. But there have been a few lists which can act as the reference. So when we look at the OECD list of environmental goods, we see that the trade in environmental goods has seen a rise in the South Asia. The exports have been rising as well, but the rise in imports have been higher. I think I pressed this, right? And another pattern that I want to highlight is that South Asia's trade in environmental goods is heavily dominated by India. India's share in South Asia's trade of environmental goods account for more than 80% on imports and more than 90% on the export side. And we see that environmental goods occupy a smaller share of South Asia's total export volume, and which is much smaller for the low-income countries. And we also noticed that all the South Asian countries are net importers of environmental technologies. And this is not at all a bias against import, because imports are an instrumental tool for the deployment of environmental technologies in the region. But I think it is an attempt to point out the political economy situation that the heavy trade deficit in environmental goods may act as a deterrent for the liberalization of trade in environmental goods in the region. And another factor we notice is that South Asian countries have a relatively low comparative advantage in producing and exporting environmental goods. Even for countries that have a relatively high level of competitiveness in producing and exporting these products, more notably India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, they also have an overall level of disadvantage when it comes to exporting these products. And the study we did at Saudi, we found that in many of the environmental goods, South Asian countries had a relative comparative advantage in only of the few environmental goods. And in some of the countries that, for example, in Nepal, the environmental goods that we export are mostly the agricultural environmental goods, such as the jute products. So there is a significant lack of manufacturing capacity when it comes to the production of environmental goods. And as Dr. Pramila had also pointed out before, tariffs in environmental goods are still high in the region. And there are many products where tariffs are actually very high. So we see that trade in environmental goods is rising in the region, but there is ample evidence that there are significant barriers to scaling up the trade of environmental goods and services in the region. And the major barriers could be broadly categorized into the direct trade barriers, which are the tariff and non-tariff barriers that impede the trade of environmental goods and services in the region. And the other set of barrier could be referred to as the barriers in producing and exporting environmental goods. And I believe that these barriers emanate from a combination of multilateral issues, regional issues, and the issues in domestic policies. So let me start with what I mean by the multilateral barrier to scaling up trade in environmental goods and services. The negotiations for reducing barriers in environmental goods and services has been going on in WTO for quite some time, especially after the Doha Declaration of 2001 mandated that tariffs and non-tariff barriers in environmental goods and services be reduced. While these negotiations had some momentum for a time, different lists were being produced, different approaches were being discussed, they ultimately stalled. So the multilateral system has failed to go beyond its core tenet of predictable and transparent trade to essentially remove the tariff and non-tariff barriers that impede the trade of environmental goods. And in the multilateral provision for trade in services, the World Trade Report mentions that many of the environmental sectors are actually the least committed sectors in the WTO. So my first point is that the multilateral system has largely failed to remove the tariff and non-tariff barriers to scale up trade in environmental goods and services globally, but in South Asia as well. So lacking a multilateral solution to the barriers in the trade of environmental friendly goods, I think a greater role could have been played by the regional cooperation and regional initiatives. For instance, regional cooperation and regional trade agreements could have played a significant role in reducing the tariffs and non-tariff barriers in the trade of environmental goods, as well as facilitating the better flow of trade in environmental services. And more importantly, through the other complementary efforts such as the transfer of knowledge, the technology transfer, the regional cooperation could have resulted in the development of green value chains, development of value chain in environmental goods sector, since it is mostly in cross-border value chains that environmental technologies are produced. But as we all know, the regional cooperation in South Asia has mostly been defunct, and the trade agreement that could have helped the trade of environmental goods and services, the SAFTA has mostly been stagnant. And we all know that South Asia is a region that is replete with tariff and non-tariff barriers that impede the intra-regional flow of goods and services. So my second point is that we have also not had a regional solution to removing the barriers of trade and removing the tariff and non-tariff barriers to the trade of environmental goods and services in the region. And finally, in the domestic front, I think the biggest challenge has been the lack of priority that this sector, the environmental goods and services, gets in the policy making. Now, I think a part of that emanates from the fact that most of the South Asian countries have not been competitive when it comes to producing and exporting environmental goods. But I think we have also failed to get the fundamentals right when it comes to developing manufacturing capabilities, when it comes to developing regional value chains, when it comes to developing green regional value chains, and when it comes to developing value chains concerning environmental technologies. And as was eloquently mentioned by Dr. Chanda yesterday in the session on green value chain, I think the crucial elements that are needed in developing a value chain, in developing a green value chain, would be getting the trade policy and industrial policy right, and capacitating the investment institutions to get the investment flowing, ensuring that private sectors play a proactive role in the integration into value chains, into the environmental goods sector, and also learning from some of the best experiences that has resulted in the integration of countries into the environmental goods value chain. I think we have failed to do that, and hence most of the South Asian countries are replete with barriers to trade in environmental goods and services, which include high tariffs in environmental goods, as well as high tariffs in intermediate products, which prevents our successful integration into the environmental goods and services value chain. I pause my intervention here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kshitij. Not only just for providing a sense of the barriers that are there at various levels. In fact, when you were talking about the revealed comparative advantage numbers, what struck me immediately is that it's not just about the border policies. A large part of it is about the domestic policies in our cases. And it would be useful to actually identify, is it about skills? Is it about infrastructure? Is it lack of regulation? Is it the basic problem of the manufacturing sector, labor laws, whatever it is, the whole list of it, because I'm sure the general problems that affect the manufacturing sector in this region would be affecting this particular sector as well. The other interesting thing was when you showed the number of products where there is comparative advantage. And the thought that came to me immediately is that there were some 40 products in the case of India. It would be interesting to know what are those products for the different countries and how much overlap is there, And is there any possibility for creating any value chains? Because I'm sure that some countries get fitted to some parts of the supply chain of some of these products. So maybe a deeper sort of look at the regional collaboration possibilities along the lines of these competitive advantage products. The other thing that struck me is, because FDI and trade have to be kind of interlinked. I mean, you cannot talk in today's world about trade without FDI. To what extent the investment facilitation for sustainable development type of discussions are relevant here in terms of promoting more investment into these kinds of technologies and these kinds of sectors, which then help enhance export access as well. So maybe I'll come back to some of these points. So thanks a lot. Next, I turn to Ms. Sita Giri to maybe dwell a little bit more on the barriers and specifically from your perspective, working in mountain crafts, Bhutan.
Thank you, Anu, other panelists, and also audience. I think Christie's has already touched upon the macro level barriers in terms of trade in environmental goods and services, and also environmentally preferred products. Me, as Anu mentioned, I'll be focusing and representing more the challenges or the barrier faced by the MSMEs. I represent Mountain Crafts Bhutan that deals with natural products from natural fibers like nettle, organic cotton grown in Bhutan, yak, and sheep wool. So from a small company perspective, what are the barriers that we face? I think number one in the list comes high tariff and non-tariff. Actually, in the case of MSMEs, it's the non-tariff barrier which is much more important, the transaction cost, because whether it's a large volume or a small volume, the procedures for customs, payments, other regulations, and licensing, these are high transaction considering a small enterprise when you compare it with the larger companies. So I think Pramila touched upon the high tariff, but I would say non-tariff component is equally important as a barrier. Next, limited infrastructure and connectivity. And here, Nepal, Bhutan, we share being a landlocked country. We don't have, for Bhutan, we don't have railways, we don't have sea routes. So which means transportation cost is significantly high compared to other countries that have access to sea or rail, more efficient transport system. So poor transport networks, inefficient logistics, and also digital infrastructure, limited digital infrastructure, I think hinders us really making progress in this sector. I mean, if you look at the shipping cost in Bhutan, like when we DHL or use EMS, from Bhutan, it's like if you compare to the shipping cost from India or Nepal, Bhutan, we pay twice the amount for shipping, whether you're shipping to US or UK or Europe. So there is a lot of barrier because of the lack of logistics that we face. Third, high cost of green technologies, and I think that's general for also larger companies. Environmental friendly goods and services, including the renewable energy equipment and sustainable products, are also often expensive, and especially South Asian markets, for the South Asian markets. And these high costs also deter the transition of the traditional industries towards greener or pro-green efficient, energy efficient practices or industries or technology. So there's a high cost, and particularly like coming from Bhutan, labor, high labor cost, less population. How do we compete with like two giants? On the South India, north we have China, and you have Bhutan with less than 1 million population. So the whole competitive pricing doesn't work for Bhutan and small countries like Bhutan. Finally, I would like to also touch upon, we can't talk about trade in environmental goods and services and environmentally preferred products without talking about poverty reduction. Poverty remains a significant issue in South Asia. South Asia is accounted for 29% of the world's extreme poor. So when people are living in poverty, the cost is a priority than sustainability. So how do you manage this? So it's not just about addressing the barriers related to trade, but also addressing poverty issues at the same time and investment in sustainable development goals. I think I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for not only highlighting the specific concerns that especially smaller landlocked developing countries face, but also with this last point, because a lot of this is really a very difficult balancing act for governments. I mean, are you going to really prioritize when people are, not having jobs, not having food security, and so on? But that also raises a question, what then could be the way of leveraging these new opportunities to try and create new kinds of jobs? Of course, there would need to be investment in skilling and some basic things which, again, whether fiscal space is there or not, all these other issues will come. But how can one integrate through some of these products, especially the ones that you mentioned, whether it's on the farming side or handicrafts and things like that? What sort of multiplier effect could you have there in terms of employment generation, skilling, etc., which both alleviates poverty and helps on the environment side? So anyway, we'll come back to this point. Let me go next to Mr. Soumitra Nopane. I think you wanted to talk about the balance between developing the North-South issues and parity issues in current practice of
Thank you,
PG
Dr.
trade.
Chandra. I am by training a political economy student, practitioner, don't specialize in trade, but have interest in sustainability. So this was a good opportunity to externally reflect on environmental goods and services trade. Where do I begin? I think the point that I want to begin is that this whole idea of environment no longer equates to environment. And that is where the definitional challenges and biases start reflecting, right? Environment today equates to climate change. And how the current norms governing EGS trade have been conceptualized, and the differences that lie in interpreting what is environment is kind of emanating from this point that environment is either climate change or it is not climate change. And you see this definitional bias reflection when developing countries have their own imagination of what is environment. For us, environment would be anything that is green, that is produced with organic fertilizers, whereas you have a global trade regime that says environment is a technology that helps abate climate change or mitigate climate change. And you see good data around EV and then battery technology and whatnot being floated around, and certain countries having advantages over others. But essentially at this heart is this question of parity that this particular current discourse evokes between developing countries and those countries that are already developed. My second point would be to place this question of parity within how technology is advanced and where this technology is being used or who has access to this technology. I think as a policy professional, it is an interesting element to look at this foray of ideas between technology, use, and access. I think a very good point was mentioned when we started talking about SMEs and MSMEs, and I think therein you can also see this difference. It must be recognized, and I think across the 2 days we've had this discussion plentiful, is the economic base within which the countries are currently operating, right? So Nepal is different from India, and India is different from Japan, though we are all part of a region, and we would want to see India and Nepal being developing economies, or even Bangladesh. We are operating within a set of norms that govern our economies, but also the infrastructure that kind of support economic development, the nature of firms and their capabilities to either look at innovation, produce innovation, generate investment, and kind of dovetail your production processes into green value chains. I think there is a big difference in this, right? And then if you kind of take this idea into contextualizing capability with the current competition, then it really throws off the discussion somewhere else. A very good example is to look at this current discourse around India's own renewable energy transition and the kind of green opportunities it is creating, India's potential to kind of integrate into the green value chain in its current formats, what benefits it might rise for the region, as well as the competition that exists in the region and what other countries could do from it, right? For example, even if India is an exception to come into the green value chain to produce environmental goods in its current form, and I think even in today's discussion, there was this discussion around creating regional value chains, creating opportunities for India's energy transition, for renewable energy development and all. Nepal does not have that economic capability as it currently stands to kind of integrate into that particular value chain. And even if it does, right, where is it going to source investments? We are already facing immense challenges with having some Chinese contractor develop a Nepali hydropower plant and not being able to sell net, right? Tomorrow that could extend to technology. I'm afraid tomorrow when geopolitical competition rises, this could say maybe impact also tourism, our flights. Paras was mentioning this morning about certain concessions. Concessions on trade logistics. Who knows where this geopolitical competition tomorrow is going to extend and going to hurt us. So we're really operating in a landscape that is perturbated. We're talking about environment, but environmental and climate goals, but that is being discussed within really narrow fields of interest and very particular interest of particular countries that are either using protectionist measures or are concerned about future use. Like the classic case is China wanting to include bicycles, right? Include in the environmental goods and services, and how that was rejected by other countries, including the US, for obvious reasons. My third point then would be like really bringing this down to the South Asian context and seeing whether there is potential for countries to really make use of this opportunity or reevaluate this opportunity to best suit their interest. I think some good points have been mentioned, and this whole idea of multilateral failures, platform failures, and thinking regional or thinking even preferential trade agreements might be good. I think there is immense opportunity here. And then the need for such integrations are even profound is because, and I repeatedly use India as example because why not? It's at the center of the region, and it's a big trading partner, a trade and transit partner for everybody. There are things that even countries like India are going to suffer, right? Even with renewable energy technology. Let's put India's renewable energy transition into perspective of rare earth minerals value chain, right? And then you get into a very different ball game, right? So then India is also suffering from what potential it has because the trade is controlled by somewhere else, and then some countries tend to benefit more. So really this idea of understanding what is happening within capabilities, context, domestic policies is an important element to start rethinking around regional or even preferential trade agreements. And examples from the ASEAN have shown that this whole idea of green taxonomy is really an interesting element to see how we can forge regional consensus, right? You would say that ASEAN includes countries that are way contrastingly different, but tend to agree at least on a few common norms. And I think there is that particular potential that we could really use. And we really don't have a choice per se to say that we are not going to be concerned about this. Again, I'll use India as an example, but for example, India, its trade agreement with Japan its trade agreement with the UAE, recent, and looking at SAFTA. It cannot say I'm going to be more concerned about environment when I'm dealing with Japan and the UAE, and not so concerned about the environment when I'm dealing with Nepal and other countries in the region. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you. You've kind of, again, taken us a few steps back as to what are we really talking about. The elephant, I mean, just even what is the conceptualization, going back that far on what we mean by environmental goods and services, bringing a reality check in terms of the geopolitics, again, and also the point you made that even for what is considered an environmentally friendly product, there is a value chain and something underlying that which may not necessarily be environmentally friendly, or it's dominated by someone else. So therefore, what is good, look in a limited sense, may actually not end out being so good for a country. Interesting point about the role of PTAs, that if you've already got certain benchmarks in there, then you should actually reflect that, and your ambition levels should reflect that with other partners as well. Of course, then the question of capacity comes with the partners as well, because in some cases, perhaps it is pushed by the partners. Here, there are more asymmetries perhaps, and the partners may themselves be not in a position to take on very stringent provisions. So I think one has to look at the balance of power amongst the negotiating countries. The issue of taxonomy, extremely important, and I will want to come back to that, because ASEAN provides some very good practices in this area, especially, like I was mentioning yesterday, the circular economy framework. They've really got very clear principles there. And they're working with some nuts and bolts ideas even around that. Somehow those need to be looked at as good practices, which I think should be possible for South Asia to adopt. Okay, so now over to Ms. Darshana Shrestha, who will provide us with a very interesting perspective, I think, from the women entrepreneurs, and again, the role of MSMEs.
Thank you, Rupa, and good afternoon, everyone. So our two speakers already stated that we are like, there is a significant increase in consumers' demand in environmental goods and services. And when we talk about women SMEs, 74% of women are into agriculture. And they are all MSMEs, and they are into indigenous skills. Their indigenous skills and cultural skills, they bring those skills into the products, which is very important to note here. And they have been practicing these skills from ages. Now, this can be the opportunity for these women to tap into the demand, where people are looking for really environmental goods, and also tap into the global market. And I would say that through these businesses of MSMEs, they are contributing to some extent for the environment and climate change also. Now, let me give you example of myself. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm into natural skincare products, and all the products are eco-friendly. And the resources I use are all predominantly locally sourced. In the beginning, I created a really social, economical, and environmental impacts, through environmental impacts. And talking about the environmental impacts that I've created through my company, I would like to state here. The first one is that I used to have plastic packaging, and now I'm changed into biodegradable degradable packaging. Number two is like I have plastic bottles for my massage oil, and now I'm slowly shifting to recycling bottles. And thirdly, to dry my herbs, I use renewable energy. So these are the simple steps that I committed from the beginning to bring out eco-friendly products. So This is the opportunity for me at this age to tap the bigger global market where there is a bigger demand. At the same time, I'm facing lots of challenges when I'm adopting to these biodegradable and recycled products, because when I wanted to buy bottles for my massage oil, you can't source it in Nepal. You have to depend either to India or China. And when you have to order, then you need to order bulk orders. SMEs like me and other micro entrepreneurs, they can't deal with this huge amount of transactions because their transactions are, very slow and little. Another challenges that I faced is the transportation, like others said. It's very difficult and it's very expensive for us also. So these problems and these challenges impacted me in my productivity efficiency. The cost of each product increased. And when I go to the global market with this price in the competitive market, so my sales definitely become slow. And that is not feasible for me to adopt all these things and go ahead. This is the problem not only for me, but also about all the other entrepreneurs that are dealing with this eco-friendly products. And there are other members who are doing eco-friendly businesses. For example, in honey, she's there, and she's struggling to meet the stringent certification and standards to meet the global standards. Although there is a huge demand for organic honey and the products of the byproducts of the bees, and we all know that bees are the main actors for biodiversity, and the climate change and this pesticides, definitely they are decreasing the population of the bees. So these are the challenges, and one of the challenges I am facing is in exporting. I do little export. The consignment is smaller, and we have to wait for others to take it with other consignments. That also charges a lot. And as I use glass bottles, there is a high risk of breakage also, and that also costs money there. So from all the sides, SMEs, they have to bear all these challenges. So how do I cope with all these challenges? Because I have to do my business and I have to have profits. So there are such organizations like associations for crafts producers. They are, intensely inclined towards mitigating the climate change by installing solar panels, wastewater management plans, and displacing firewoods and kerosene for the ceramic productions. They have their own problems. But they're trying to collaborate and trying to bring small entrepreneurs like us. And they take our products with them and they try to export to different countries. And that is very helpful for an entrepreneur like me to create brand and to sell in the competitive price in the global market. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, a big reality check as to the practical sort of problems, day-to-day problems that small entrepreneurs are facing. In fact, when you were talking about, the importance of scale, the dependence on imports, that it's not viable. So the thought that immediately comes is what role associations, industry chambers can play, but also what role can MSME policies play, right? So because you actually need a clustered approach here, because there'll be some common challenges, and you somehow need to locate some of these entrepreneurs around an area where then you get the scale economies in terms of use of certain subsidized infrastructure, etc. So to what extent that is happening in your country, for instance, because use of renewables, many would want to shift, but economically not viable for an individual entrepreneur, but that can be done in a cluster, for instance. Similarly, packaging, imports of bottles and so on would probably be something affecting many other small entrepreneurs. So maybe a more targeted sort of approach to see what are those common areas of challenge, and then trying to support that through government policies and embedding it in the MSME policy itself is important, in terms of targeted support in certain areas. The other question that came to my mind when you were talking is the role of e-commerce. I know at the end of the day, whether you do the orders digitally, you still have to deliver the products physically, so those transit and other issues are there. But to what extent you can get more scale economies because of increased demands, increased visibility by using e-commerce platforms? Maybe you can touch upon that in the second round. So let me open the floor to some questions before going to the second round of intervention. Any questions coming from the first round of interventions by the panelists? Yes, please.
Small observation. The point which you made about China's proposal on bicycles, it promotes environmentally friendly behavior. And just to give you an example, it's not a non-tradable service, but the airport train in Stockholm and Oslo are labeled as environmentally friendly, precisely for this reason. Now, the train is not environmentally friendly at all. But the fact is that it replaces motor cars, and it does a huge, service to environment. Point to be noted. I'm sure that would have been the argument made by China and may have been rejected, but that is unfortunate.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, not responding to that particular topic, but I'll give good cases, Nepal's EV transition also. So you see a lot of EVs in the street today, but it's replacing fuel. So there is an environmental service that is being provided by that switch, but it is unaccounted for even in any carbon markets, right? But you could technically dovetail that into an environmental service and package it. I think it's about a matter of how a country chooses to package that particular intervention.
Rupa, just to complete, these are non-tradable services, but points to be recognized that there are various measures which can be undertaken in order to promote environmentally friendly behavior. Now, Delhi Transport Corporation advertises as the largest eco-friendly transport service in the world because it uses CNG. Now, buses are not environmentally friendly, but the fact is the bus service is environmentally friendly. Now, these are non-tradable, but the point is that they have to be kept in mind when you talk in terms of traded environmentally friendly goods and services. And within a region, of course, there is certainly services that, of course, are interchangeable in the sense that a bus can travel from Kathmandu to Delhi, whether it is environmentally friendly or not, is a point to be made a note of in order to promote better green behavior. Thank you.
No, very important point, actually. In fact, that is something sort of similar, even though you're talking of the non-traded part, but even things which are not directly getting traded, but which are part of the value chain in some way. So whichever way.
Between Delhi and Kathmandu or Kathmandu and Dhaka, would it not be service?
It's a service.
Tradable service.
Yeah, in this case, yeah. Yeah, but I'm saying more generally, even if you're not seeing something being directly traded, but it's an input into the process. So how you do it, so when we talk of greening the system, you have to look at green in all aspects.
In all aspects.
Yeah, and the behavioral part is of course very important, because I think without the sensitization or education or awareness raising and so on, you are not going to get a lot of this, because both the supply and the demand have to go hand in hand, right? So you can create a lot of capacity, but people's behavior because of extra cost or whatever it is doesn't change.
30-second
Yeah.
intervention. I've been working with the Government of India on eco-friendly products since the year 1993. We advocated and succeeded. But the tragedy is that the bureaucracy still doesn't understand these values. They're still looking at billion per parts and so on and so forth. In order to certify any good to be environmentally friendly, it has to be better than what is a normal good. I'm just giving you an example where you have this kind of bureaucratic ignorance or insouciance. So how do you deal with it?
You start by training them. No, actually, this came up. We recently did a workshop in Jakarta on circular economy, and they said first train the bureaucrats, train their mindset, and then a lot of other things will change.
So put the bureaucrats through the circle.
Anyway, okay, so let me turn to my panelists again.
There is another question.
Oh, there is another question? Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Thanks.
No, it was interesting. So we were
Yeah.
listening to the exchange. One thing I wanted to ask, actually, it was brought up by a colleague from Bhutan on the importance of logistics. I'm glad to see the presentation that talked about both trade in green goods and green services is important. But do you think trade facilitation for green goods and green services perhaps is different than regular goods and regular services? I don't know. I'm just wondering. Because looking at our region, logistics challenges are enormous. I think Bhutan, Nepal, these two countries are at the receiving end of logistical challenges, not just transport, but generally customs infrastructure. The rules, even the being Nepali goods to get clearance to sell in India and vice versa. There are many challenges, right? So, is it maybe now the challenges are bigger because of green goods?
Yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely.
From my limited experience with mountain crafts, I think that's again a major challenge, because there hasn't been any difference between environment goods and normal goods. So while there is a lot of talk, but in reality, that difference and that incentive for environmental goods hasn't happened. That's my own personal experience, but it's again very limited, as I said. It's a small brand.
Let me add to that as well. Actually, sometimes the hurdles to importing goods could be greater when it is green good. Why? Because if those goods attract a lower tariff, then when we go to producers and exporters and talk about this, when certain goods attract a lower tariff, the customs officer tend to grill them more, saying, are you bringing the goods that you are claiming to bring, and why are you bringing these goods under a lower tariff? So sometimes trade facilitation is actually worse for green goods if they come with lower tariff.
I think the question you're asking, trade facilitation itself is the challenge, right? That is one. I think on the environmental goods, it comes back to the question that was raised earlier, that unless you have a prioritization and a listing of those products, and then more simplification of the procedures, etc., so that those products can be easily exported or imported. But I suspect the problems will be more in terms of importing, because you'll have to meet certain standards, requirements, etc. So probably trade facilitation challenges will be more in the case of certain kinds of green goods. I would think so. But I think it is a wider question of how do we simplify, streamline, and so on. Can we use more technology? Can we do better risk assessment? All of these things have to be done. And a lot of interagency, because one of the biggest challenges in trade facilitation, many things show up on paper, as being done, but when you actually go to the border, the mindset is still the same of doing everything paper-based, checking everything. Risk management systems really are there, again, in principle, but not exercised in practice. So I think it's a larger agenda than just about green.
India and Nepal have a very good, mirroring arrangement.
That's right.
Good. So that is a huge green move, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So maybe, are there any other questions? Okay, so let me come back to my panelists. And Pramila, since you drew upon the Aid for Trade report, so maybe you can talk a bit about how to leverage Aid for Trade to promote environmental goods trade. And can you also touch a little bit on the services aspect? Because, you know, we are completely forgetting, and me coming from services and can't not talk about services. So please, how can
Yes,
it promote
I'll talk
actually?
a little bit about all this. And if you allow me, because I just want to reflect on the last comment that has been made on the different tariff regime and certification and everything, because I'm specialized in rules of origin, and the tariff regime, indeed, I'm working a lot with customs, and the issue is that, of course, if you import a good under the professional tariff regime, there are more compliance checks, especially on the rules of origin. That's what is actually checked. So I don't think, like, I think the main issue of trade facilitation in this case, of course, transport is the same. I transport a good that is environmentally friendly or not is the same, but indeed the clearance and the certification procedures, and that's where we could, you know, think of how to improve, like certification or facilitate certification for environmental goods. And I think that's where there might be a big difference, but it means that customs officials have to be trained. That they should be able to recognize immediately a good that comes at the border and know that is an environmentally friendly one. And that's one of the main challenges. Now, set aside the question, Aid for Trade. Well, Aid for Trade is a broad term, right? It covers a lot of different type of assistance, any assistance in developing countries that can actually promote trade. And it's usually divided in different categories. You have economic infrastructure, productive capacities, and trade policy and regulations. And for now, what we observe that is like the bulk of Aid for Trade goes to infrastructure. So one important aspect I would like to say, especially in the case of trade in environmental goods and services, is that we need more Aid for Trade in trade policy and regulations. And why? Well, because infrastructure, of course, is key. We need the roads, we need the technologies, but we need also the skills and the ability to use those infrastructures and those technologies, and also have the policy and regulatory framework that is appropriate. And what could we do? I'd like also to distinguish, because in the discussions we have talked about, you know, areas of like high technologies for new technologies, and then you have small companies exporting environmentally friendly goods. I think we are talking of different things here. Like it's two different worlds. Both are to promote, you know, sustainability, but I think the ways to address those type of challenges are totally different. So first of all, if I start with reflecting on your presentation, thank you so much, and also on Bhutan, it was very enlightening. I think Aid for Trade initiative should work more with MSMEs. They really need to have them. All these challenges with small value shipments, small value imports, so connected directly to trade facilitation. How, for example, in trade facilitation procedures, you could have regulations working with the government to facilitate small value imports, you know, across the borders, and facilitate the imports of those goods and certification. And also could work with the companies to help them organize. We have talked about the role of associations. So one solution when you are too small is to, you know, join forces. So I think having international assistance there in a country to help coordinate the network of MSMEs into, you know, getting organized is also something key. And for the case of Nepal, Bhutan, or those small countries relying a lot on also traditions, I think you have said clearly. I used to work in the past, not for ADB, but for UNCTAD, where we were promoting geographical indications. In Bhutan, actually, for example, I think red rice or different products. I think there are also support there on organizing the small-scale producers into associations and getting more recognitions at the international level in other markets. And for example, geographical indications, but that could be other ways of branding. The branding strategy is, I believe, critical. That could help also compensate for, you know, the fact that your prices are rising. And I think it has been mentioned the short-term costs for small companies versus the long-term benefits of adopting sustainable practices. I think that's where Aid for Trade also should help with cost-benefit analysis to anticipate those challenges and maybe provide transition temporary assistance to help in the transition. But more research on these areas is, I think, is extremely critical. In terms now, more generally, if you take also talk about adoption of new technologies, it's very broad, but I think Aid for Trade has a role in helping governments designing policies, drafting the policies, but also negotiating agreements and supporting in regional cooperation. Because I think we call environmental mainstreaming right now, but years ago, I think 10 years ago, we were talking mostly about trade mainstreaming. That was one of the major issues in the Aid for Trade initiative. Why? Because trade is transversal, many ministries are involved. How do we mainstream trade into national development plans? Then it became with the digital, came the question of the digital. Same, it's transversal, how do you mainstream it? Now you have environment. So in all those questions, one key area is the coordination also across the different ministries in the government, because who is taking the lead? Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Technologies, Communications, Transport, Customs, which is usually Ministry of Economy and Finance. And I think also here, Aid for Trade initiatives can help building national capacities, policy dialogue, and also at the regional level. Now, I'm going to move on services because you asked, and I think on services, yes, I think one key aspect, and especially for countries that are landlocked, Nepal, Bhutan, is digital services, digitally deliverable services. How could we promote that? Because that's a way of overcoming the challenges of being landlocked. And I think one is addressing digital services. Of course, in trade agreements, that's an option, but we should not forget about the domestic constraint and domestic services regulations that should be also upgraded to consider the digital area. And I think Aid for Trade can support in designing, digital services strategy and e-commerce strategies, discussing also the issue of cross-border data flow that I know that is very critical and maybe sensitive here, but and to support the businesses in adopting these. And because one of the big barriers is not necessarily the high restrictions, or this is one, but is also the regulatory heterogeneity, especially in services. If you don't have the same regulation as in the partner, if you have no consumer protection and you want to export to the EU, it's a problem. So these are areas where I believe Aid for Trade can help, among many others. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Pramila. I think, especially because you touched upon both the big sort of picture of technologies and environmental products, as well as how you can tailor Aid for Trade towards the needs of the MSMEs, the kind of challenges we heard. Maybe now, Kshitij, if you can talk about especially the role of regional cooperation and some initiatives that could be taken up.
Thank you. So, with the multilateral system not making significant headways into reducing barriers in trade of environmental goods and services, I think there is ample scope for regional cooperation and regional initiatives to enhance the flow of trade in environmental goods and services. However, we all know that the state of regional trade has not been that good in the region. The SAARC mechanism is mostly defunct, and the dialogues are barely there. But assuming that we can slowly get the dialogues moving and the SAARC mechanism can be revived, let me talk about a couple of regional cooperation initiatives that can perhaps enhance the flow of environmental friendly goods and services in the region. And I think the first thing I want to talk about is how South Asia could could define its approach around environmental goods and services, which was discussed here by other panelists as well. First, South Asia could make it clear what it means by environmental goods and services. So South Asia could come up with a list of environmental goods and services that it deems crucial and that it intends to liberalize as well as reduce non-tariff barriers. But we all know that this approach was tried in the WTO and it did not succeed owing to the technical complications that this approach has, because the environmental goods and goods are difficult to define in harmonized system 6-digit label. And there are other complications such as the issue of dual use of environmental goods. So South Asia could also take other approaches. I remember that during the negotiations, India had proposed in 2005 a different concept to liberalizing trade in environmental goods and services. It had proposed what was referred to as the, I think, integrated project approach, whereby a nationally designated authority would endorse environmental projects, and those projects would qualify for obtaining environmental goods and services in a concessional manner. So the first thing the regional cooperation could do is define its approach to enhancing trade in environmental goods and services in the region, define what approach it wants to take, whether it wants to take the least best approach or take a broader approach. And I think there are other ample avenues for regional cooperation, such as the removal of tariffs and non-tariff barriers in the final environmental goods as well as the intermediate goods, and as well as removing the investment barriers in the region. I think these could help develop green value chains, develop value chains for environmental goods in the region. And studies find that one of the major barriers in the trade of environmental goods is often the technical barriers to trade, the TBT measures. And it involves compliance with certain standards. It involves the conformity assessment procedures, whereby the exporting countries have to prove compliance with the standards specified, and TBT has also been identified as one of the major NTMs impeding the trade of environmental goods in the region. So perhaps there is a scope for regional cooperation there as well, for instance, in harmonizing the standards or coming up with some institutional arrangement for regional certification, as Dr. Abid Suleri had also mentioned yesterday. And finally, I think there is also the scope for better trade facilitation when it comes to environmental goods. For instance, one solution could be that most of the South Asian countries already have some form of single window. So one way could be having a regional single window to facilitate the trade of environmental goods. And the UN SCAP has been doing a lot of work in the cross-border paperless trade with its framework agreement on cross-border paperless trade. So perhaps select South Asian countries could join the agreement and could start benefiting from the technical assistance mentioned in the agreement, and could at least pilot the relatively non-controversial trade in environmental goods for better trade facilitation in these products. So I pause my intervention here.
Thank you. I think you've touched upon many of the aspects, coming up with some common list or some common approach, a consensus. addressing the tariff and non-tariff barriers, investment barriers, trying to harmonize standards, regional certification, a lot of areas. My main question, though, of course, is who drives the process when governments are not willing to sit down together. So how can maybe private sector play more of an advocacy role and push at least in small steps in certain selected areas? I don't know. I mean, this is really where the challenge is in South Asia. There's no one in the driver's seat in some sense. Okay, so I think that's not something we can all answer that easily. But let me turn to actually Sita, and then I'll come to you, Darshana, after that, because I want to get the perspective from the small enterprises. Specifically, how do you see the scope for increasing trade, especially in your kinds of products, and what do you want your governments and the regional sort of approach to be?
Thank you, Rupa, on that. I think we heard quite a lot about the barriers, but there's also the good news for environmental goods and services. Growing regional demand for green solutions, rapid urbanization, industrialization, the whole climate change challenges is driving now countries and population towards sustainable goods and services. I think the data from Pramila and Christy earlier showed the increasing demand and trade in environmentally friendly goods and services. And I think South Asia, the trend is improving compared to the last 10 years, the data that shows in the recent years. So that there's positive right there. Also, this is creating opportunity for export in niche sectors. Yesterday, we heard about the energy, renewable energy. Look at the partnership between Bangladesh and Nepal. Energy sharing, energy, harnessing the energy. Similarly, India and Bhutan has been doing this for a long time and benefiting. I mean, it's a win-win. So there are also other areas such as organic textiles, and again here I mentioned my brand. I have a catalog. Later you can have a look. The brand dealing with natural fibers. Similarly, the organic textiles from Bhutan, very unique, nature-based, natural dye. So there are opportunities here. Also sustainable agriculture products. So premium products, I think there is a lot of opportunity on that. There's a lot of interest. Ecotourism, I think it's gaining a lot of momentum, not just tourism, but also ecotourism, and how does the tourism benefit the environment, but also the population, the communities. I think that's an area which is growing, the green infrastructure, green resorts, green transport, and I think countries are moving. I think we talked about moving from towards renewable energy, even in Bhutan, and also in the region, Nepal, India, the electric vehicles, the increase in that trend. So there's a lot of potential area that we have seen. Private sector engagement, I think that's an area where a lot needs to be done. And thank you, SAES, and the platform here for having us, because I think at the end of the day, policymakers, think tanks, scientists can talk about issues and make policies and plan, but it's the private sector and the businesses actually, they play a critical role in actually making that happen, and also bringing innovation. How do we make our production more environment friendly? How do we reduce the carbon footprint in the production process? It's the private sector that does it and applies that. I would also like to share, I think Pramila talked about branding strategy. The public-private partnership, I think we need the support of the government in this area. I just give example from Bhutan, the Brand Bhutan initiative, which basically kind of goes with Made in Bhutan and Grown in Bhutan slogan. And this is introduced by the Ministry of, the Department of Trade, and also supported by EIF. And Mountain Craft is also a recipient of this award based on the quality. They look at the sustainability aspect and the quality of the product. And then this actually motivates the enterprises to really go for high quality and also environmental friendly products. So I think these kind of public-private partnership where government support with the policies and incentive to small SMEs, MSMEs, I think it's a way forward, starting with small scale, but then it can be also replicated at the larger scale. So the branding strategy and public-private partnership, I would say, there's a lot of scope that we can harness. Thank you.
Thank you for, again, bringing back the criticality of the private sector. You know, without the private sector, none of the things really get executed. And also highlighting, you know, where some potential areas could be where the government can kind of nudge and give the support that the private sector needs, certification, recognition, branding, those kinds of areas. And I assume even skilling related things could be from the government, apart from provision of infrastructure and things. Maybe now over to you, and you know the question I had asked earlier
Okay.
also.
So earlier you asked about the associations that can bring all the SMEs together and support them. Yes, FWIN, Federation of Women Entrepreneurs Associations of Nepal, which is all over the Nepal, because they work with MSMEs and also with the grassroots women. So we bring together to the platform where they can do the marketing, trade. So one of the things we have been doing is the International Trade Expo, where we bring all the women entrepreneurs to that platform, and also we bring the buyers from across the border and also the exhibitors from across the borders. And there they learn how to trade their products. And by seeing the products of others, they know how to develop their products. So it's been a couple of years that we have been doing, and they have changed a lot. So one of the initiatives is that, and other initiatives is that you talked about the digitalizing the businesses. Yes, we have been doing like since 2015, but it was in a dormant state because we didn't know the importance and value of digitalization then. And only after COVID, then we realized, you know, how the digital platforms are important for us to grow the businesses. So we started with a partnership model because we are not efficient alone. You know, we needed partners, the expertise. So how we partnered is like the researcher and the digital platform and us. We have women entrepreneurs, and we needed the real data on how women entrepreneurs are doing their businesses and what they needed, what are the real, you know, things they need to expand their businesses. So we did research. We have women entrepreneurs, and the other hand, we had this digital platform. So during the COVID, it was really difficult for all these SMEs. Most of them were, you know, had to close their businesses. But through this partnership, we were able to regain their businesses, and they were able to sell their products in that platform. And FWIN established its own digital platform, that is winbiz.com, where these MSMEs can come and join the platform. And it is not for selling their products, just to practice on how to be in that platform. For example, to create content, to keep the pictures, to answer to the, you know, buyers online. So that's how we created the WinBiz. And once they are ready there, then they are ready to go to the bigger platforms where they can really sell their products and where they really transact their business, you know. So, and we also established the app, a simplest app for these grassroots and MSMEs to incorporate their accounting systems there. So it's at the end of the day, they can see their transaction. You know, they can put all their transactions as per their daily transaction, weekly, or monthly. So one of the problems, challenges for them is to access the fund from the financial institutions. And that helped them to show their transaction, and now they know in which state they are, whether they're in profit or whether they're in loss. So that's how we are helping them to grow their businesses. And you mentioned about I talked about e-commerce.
I talked about the role of government and how they could support.
So yeah, role
clusters.
of government is very important, and we have been continuously advocating in the issues of women, mainly the economic issues, and they are listening to us, I have to say, because in the budget or in the policies, they incorporate the issues for women. For example, the subsidy loans for women, or the place like a green industrial state. They have separated the space for women only to have this business, green business. So it's a space where all the green businesses, women that are into green business can come and work together, and all the facilities are provided there. It's in the growing stage now. So they are doing lots of things. Besides, we still need to have policy interventions or policy implementations and amendments specifically addressing to these women MSMEs. You know, they can't put all the women entrepreneurs in the same basket with all the bigger businesses. We need customized policies. So, and what we realize in trading is like they should mitigate the challenges in the bureaucracy level also, you know. There are wonderful policies, there are wonderful plans and programs, so that has to be implemented. So for women, it is a bit difficult that they get intimidated when going to such at that level, at the bureaucracy level. So what we need to think about is the enterprise itself also. They need to have a growth mindset. They can't say just like, oh, we are this, we are women, or they need to have the growth mindset, and the work they are doing should be persistent and, you know, consistency, I would say. So in women, we see that there is like ups and downs, and the consistency level is not that good. Thirdly, it's about the business organization, that what we are doing to women. We are the voice of these unheard women, you know, unheard women, where we collect all their issues and keep on the desks, right? And we take to the relevant stakeholders. That's how the government is listening. So that's the role, and also the capacity building, maybe in terms of trade, in terms of digitalization, any packaging, or whatever needed to upgrade their businesses. And lastly, there are donors and development partners. So they should be supporting individual enterprises, government, and business organizations to meet all the goals that they have.
Thank you very much. I think my takeaway from this is there's a lot that needs to be done nationally to bring in a gender lens across a variety of areas, whether it's financial inclusion, MSME policies, etc., before we even start talking about regional and collaboration and all that.
One more thing is like, we recently signed a MOU with a regional network business women organization. We have Bangladesh, we have Nepal, we have Sri Lanka. There were a couple of countries. And the signatory is to share experiences, regional peer learning, and promoting of these environment, goods and services, and learn from the best practices, what they are doing, and we are using it. So that has been the new, you know, milestone for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A lot of need for private sector dialogue within the region, public-private dialogue within the country and across the region. I mean, that's how I would kind of sum up what you've said. Last but not least, Soumitra.
I would want to go back to this idea of taxonomy. I think we've been discussing what is green, so the fact that we've not been able to agree on green. Check. Okay. So this idea of taxonomy is really, you need to understand this and place this within the interaction of firms and markets. It's really, really important. So in a given country, there are different types of firms accessing different markets. So taxonomy is really that instrument that allows firms to better interact with their markets, right? Establish duty of care, communicate value, reduce compliance cost, and maybe even like generate investments and facilitate investments. where this really matters is this idea of taxonomy. You left, right, and center, everybody's now talking about taxonomy, and then you almost feel that it is somewhat incoherent, that really some regions are doing their own things, and then is it going to harmonize? Is this going to be uniform? I think uniformity is the last thing that taxonomy should aim for. Harmonization at best, but not still at an HS code level, but harmonization just in terms of understanding. I think that is where we need to start, right? And where I think learning from this panel today and our own research into SMEs and how businesses are generally organized, that's a bottoms-up approach, right? The fact that in countries like Nepal and Bhutan, where the broadest base of economic institutions are at that level of SMEs, where there are significant capability constraints, how many SMEs actually export environmental goods, right? Very few. So looking at markets and then looking at taxonomy that can enable this duty of care and access markets where relevant is really important. Sometimes we tend to overthink what markets are. Yes, there will be a couple of firms that are highly capable and can access niche markets in niche sectors, but that is very small. What about the other thousands and thousands of firms who are really important for jobs creation, employment generation, etc., right? Let's not overthink on markets. South Asia is an emerging economy, or it's emerged already, right? There is that value proposition there. I am pretty sure there's so many firms with a regional taxonomy that can enable just facilitate goods and services into this particular region, which has now additional purchasing, a section of the population has purchasing power to pay for value addition of environment or sustainability in their consumption patterns. That is a big enough market for many firms to access, right? So when you start talking about taxonomy, it's not just reaching into European markets or American markets, but also looking at regional markets or even domestic markets, right? I go into shopping into a department store and I see 5 products that say organic. I would want to pay for organic. I do pay for organic, but I do not know. That value proposition is not clearly communicated. So it's not just that there is a market in Europe, there's a market in the domestic front, there's a market in the regional front. And I think this whole idea of taxonomy, when working with MSMEs, can really enable that process to better understand what level of capability functioning they are in, and then where they can go. So looking at both potential and prospects and being flexible to kind of address both would be really important. So then it enables us to talk about things like same but differential responsibility, right? How do countries like Nepal and Bhutan, for example, benefit from the current scheme of things? We don't have to stand with India or Bangladesh or Europe. We can have our own preferential trade agreement where we start operationalizing some of this taxonomy and then putting into use those small, and then move from there to larger scales, and then start imagining South Asia as a green trading bloc. I briefly talked about India being at the center of this trading arrangement in South Asia and its own discrepancies of how environmental values are embedded within current trade arrangements the country has with OECD partners and non-OECD partners, and those in South Asia and in the region, right? So I think that gradual extension of capabilities within that taxonomy really allows us to imagine a good interaction between firm and markets at the domestic level and then at the regional level. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, the issue of taxonomy, I think, resonates all through. And the fact that you have to visualize that within the context of the economies, their capacities, the kind of enterprises that they have, and not just aim for some ambitious taxonomy. So the issue of capacity constraints that you keep highlighting and the market context is a very important one. And also what you propose that, not everything has to be looked at from the entire South Asia. There could be smaller pilots and smaller bilaterals and so on, which incrementally then build up towards a regional sort of solution or collaborative approach. So thanks a lot for that insight. Any last questions at all? Yes, please. Please introduce yourself also. You also didn't introduce.
Okay, hi, Swastik Aryal from VROC. I just had a question for Dr. Pramila and Mr. Chitij. So, the importance of international cooperation was highlighted to liberalize environmental goods, right? But then Mr. Chitij also pointed out that regional or multilateral approaches for this have been unsuccessful. And he, on the later stage, he highlighted that there is space for regional cooperation to actually revamp these agendas. And he mentioned that dialogues can be initiated even though SARC has been defunct. But then Dr. Pramila's approach about starting small with smaller trade agreements between two countries or trilateral agreements, and then going for the broader regional could be a solution, right? So I just wanted to know which would be the better approach. Maybe a solution is not available at this moment, but then since SARC has been defunct and as mentioned, that national priorities are not in the environmental goods right now. So what is kind of the, what do you guys see as a favorable solution? Maybe it's a broad question for now.
Well, I will answer by saying that these are not necessarily in contradiction. I think if you think of the multilateral context and the regional trade agreements, at the time in the 90s when the preferential trade agreements were rising, everybody was thinking about, how does it work in the context of the WTO? And we noticed that with empirical evidences that they are more complements than substitutes. Okay. So I would suggest that in the case of a regional cooperation and then going smaller, I believe there is also complementarity, not substitutability. So, in other words, I believe you can do both because you will not address the same thing. If you think, I will give you an example with Southeast Asia because we talked about our SAP, which is a plurilateral agreement, 15 economies. And, the same day that the RCEP entered into force, there was also a bilateral agreement entering into force between Cambodia and China. So you may say, well, why do we observe the two agreements entering into force at the same time? Well, because they do not address the same issues. The one and the bilateral one would address very specific targeted sectors. Maybe they would, approach more the issues of specific MSMEs, maybe specific products, as it was discussed, which in selected areas. While the broader cooperation would set the general framework that you can follow. So all these layers for me are not in contradiction as long as they are coordinated and that countries and governments and private sector, they are all informed of what is going on. And it relates to something I wanted to say that has not been said, but it is indirectly related, but thinking of the multilateral context, Nepal, that is going to graduate soon from the least developed countries. I think no one has mentioned that so far, but I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. Bangladesh will also graduate, and I noticed from my work at the WTO in the past, and also in that I noticed that countries like Nepal Nepal was not very vocal in WTO context. And if you compare with Cambodia, who's going to graduate now in 2029, they ask for a grace period, their extension. They have been much more, requesting much more, while Nepal has tended to just agree, not negotiate much and accept whatever was actually imposed. And that's where I say it for sure should also build negotiating capacities, but also countries should not be shy to talk and take the floor in international discussions. And in SPS activities that has been discussed, there is a committee in the WTO, which is called the Specific Trade Concerns. And typically, countries like Nepal or smaller economies, they never raise concerns. Well, they are the countries that should actually raising the concerns, but they never do. So I think that these are things because there is a lack of coordination at the different levels. So if there were more discussions, across the levels relating to your questions, if you do start having those different layers, it's fine, but it's important they communicate with each other. No, thank you very much.
I totally agree with what Pramila said. So that's a difficult question. I think hypothetically, I think the problem of climate change that affects all the countries, I think the best solutions would, of course, be multilateral removal of all the tariffs and non-tariff barriers in environmental goods and services. But I don't think we are going to have that, especially since there are new challenges emerging for the multilateral system. And regional solution would also be the next best solution for enhancing the trade of environmental goods and services in the region. But I think we know that that is not going to happen anytime soon as well, because the system has been mostly defunct and the dialogues have not been going and the signs are not too positive. So we cannot just wait for the multilateral system and the regional system to be functional so that we can start enhancing the trade of environmental goods and services. So I think we need to take actions unilaterally and bilaterally as well. We need to first, before we talk about green value chains, first we need to also look into why we are not being able to integrate ourselves into other kind of value chains as well, before we develop our manufacturing capability, before we solve the constraints we had in integrating into the global value chains. We cannot get into the green value chains and the value chains of environmental goods and services as well. So I think hypothetically multilateral and regional solutions are the best solutions, but these are not very forthcoming. So we need to move forward with whatever progress we can make.
Thank you. You might be wondering why I let everybody extend beyond, because we started a little bit late. But I think what we are kind of coming towards is that you need multiple approaches. You need to keep working at it, whether it's in small pilots or bilateral, multilateral, regional, plurilateral, etc., all of these. But yes, at the end of the day, you need to ensure there's coherence across the different approaches, and therefore coordination within countries and across groups of countries is important. I think we've had the macro picture, the micro picture, and how to link the two through all the discussion that we've had across the speakers. So 1 minute each for each one of you, your last statement, and then we will wrap up. You first, yes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to lunch. No, but yeah, I think there is immense potential for countries in the region. And I would like to end by saying that really banking on what our strengths are and really capitalizing that into whatever value chains we can access is the best way forward.
To add, let us keep in mind that women who are into indigenous skills, and they have keen interest for the growth. So that has to be taken in mind. And there are possibilities, lots of possibilities with a partnership for their growth. So I urge you all to collaborate with us for them. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think the wrap-up has already said it all, but yeah, I think we need to continue collaborate at all the different levels, also with the private sector. It's very important to be inclusive in the process, consider even civil societies, all the stakeholders and different types of interests, so that we get to the best sustainable solutions. Thank you.
I would just like to say that we would have to get our fundamentals right, so that when finally multilateral system or regional system hopefully get back into action again, we are in a much better shape to better integrate into the multilateral and regional system.
I would say there is will. There are also policy frameworks, international level, regional level, but I think we need to walk the talk. I think I'll close with that.
Thank you very much. And now we'll all walk to lunch and walk the talk there. Thank you very much for being such a good audience.